everyone, Ewan for What Culture here, and summer blockbuster season formally kicked off this past weekend with Ryan Gosling and Emily Blunt's new action comedy, The Fall Guy, which, on paper, had a hell of a lot going for it. From the sheer likability of its two leads, who are both fresh off colossal hits in Barbie and Oppenheimer respectively, to the clout of director David Leitch, who worked on Deadpool 2 and Bullet Train, and the film's strong reception from critics, they seemingly had every ingredient it needed to be a bona fide commercial smash. And so, alarm bells began ringing when The Fall Guy opened to a disappointing $28 million in North America, far below original projections, which placed the film as high as $40 million. This pretty brutal underperformance ultimately makes it nigh impossible for The Fall Guy to turn a profit theatrically, unfortunately kicking the cinematic summer off with a bit of a flop and casting a bit of a dampener on things after the great vibes of films like Challengers, Love Lies Bleeding, Dune 2, and also the re-release of The Phantom Menace. We can't forget that either. But how did such a sure thing, seemingly, end up faltering so unexpectedly? Well, by considering every facet of The Fall Guy's creation and release, a clearer picture emerges of precisely what led it to fall flat at the box office. Ryan Gosling and Emily Blunt aren't box office draws. Though Ryan Gosling and Emily Blunt are certainly popular actors, they're actually not box office draws in and of themselves, with neither actor having a single mega hit to their name that was marketed primarily on their star power alone. Even though the duo are fresh off the biggest hits of their careers in Barbie and Oppenheimer respectively, neither film was sold or made bank because of their name being attached. They're well known and liked obviously, but they aren't putting butts in seats the same way the stars of yore did. Furthermore, both have their fair share of big budget underperformances under their belt. Most prominently, Blade Runner 2049 and The Nice Guys for Gosling and Edge of Tomorrow for Blunt. So the Fall Guy's lackluster opening weekend isn't actually anything new for them. This is ultimately part of a much wider recent trend in Hollywood though, where contemporary audiences are considerably less swayed to see a film on the strength of an A-list star and are more about the franchises and IP. An issue we have both the studios to blame for and also just shifting viewership habits. So, even with their singular charms and obvious chemistry, Gosling and Blunt were not enough to convince people to leave their house and buy a movie ticket on opening weekend. It's a reboot of an IP no one cared about. Ask the average person if they even know that The Fall Guy is based on an existing IP, and they'll probably look at you blankly, or just immediately think of the game Fall Guys instead, which, fair, that thing rocks. But indeed, the movie is based loosely on the 1980s Lee Majors starring TV series of the same name. Yet, when this branding is basically unknown to most people under the age of 40, does it in any way help the film from a commercial perspective? In an era where franchises are all the rage and you generally need to be a recognizable IP to open big at the box office, rolling the dice on a 40-plus-year-old series that a large portion of the target audience has never heard of is, well, it's definitely a choice. And so, the utter lack of visibility for this film's source material did it no favors at all when it came to planting its flag in the perilous financial landscape of big-budget cinema. And speaking of which, the budget is way too big. Last year felt like something of a reckoning for irresponsibly budgeted movies at the box office, given the sheer number of colossally priced tentpoles that underperformed or outright flopped. Looking at you, Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. But even if you put an asterisk next to some of 2023's movies due to pandemic-related cost increases, it doesn't seem like Hollywood is learning its lesson in 2024. The Fall Guy's production budget has been estimated at anywhere from $125 million to $150 million. And even if we generously accept the lower number, the 2.5 rule dictates that it needs to gross just north of $300 million worldwide to turn a profit. That's a high degree of exposure for an action comedy releasing in the current theatrical climate, and a figure which it now has no hope of reaching during its big screen run. Given the film's emphasis on practical stunt work, it truly feels like Universal should have been able to produce The Fall Guys for considerably less than $125 million. Like, how have we gone away from the days of the mid-tier budget action blockbuster from the 90s and early 2000s? We really need those again. 100 million or 80 million with some scaled down set pieces would have greatly lessened the film's need to be a mega hit. But once again, Hollywood egregiously overspent on a project while also overestimating audience demand. Unremarkable marketing. Poor marketing has sunk the commercial prospects of many a good movie. And while the Fall Guys trailers weren't awful, they were rather generic and listless. Like, you can't tell me you also didn't look at this thing and thought it was another inessential, overly CGI'd, irreverent action film that we've gotten way too many of since the beginning of the 2010s. By focusing on the broadest possible action comedy beats, but being suspiciously vague about the plot, which is far more of a murder mystery than implied, the marketing didn't really cement this movie as a surefire must-see on the big screen. It didn't help that Universal also released the first trailer a whole 6 months prior to release, because, as Argyle proved a few months ago, nothing saps an audience's desire to see a movie quite like being subjected to the same trailer over and over and over again for months at a time. By the time audiences had been shown that Bon Jovi scored trailer for The Fall Guy a couple dozen times, they'd grown a bit tired of the whole idea, and honestly, I can't blame them. It probably didn't help that the film ended up being delayed from March to May shortly after that first trailer dropped, and so, in retrospect, Universal probably would have been smart to hold back their marketing push until the start of this year instead of the end of last. Also, if we've learned anything from the Barbenheimer phenomenon from last year, it's that audiences will turn out if it's something essential or unique. Fall Guy looked like any generic straight-to-streaming action movie you can find browsing aimlessly on Netflix or Prime, not a cinematic event that needed to be seen on the biggest screen possible. Universal's PVOD strategy. It's often said that since the pandemic massively reduced the theatrical window before new movies hit streaming, audiences have effectively been conditioned to wait for most films to land at home rather than heading out to see them themselves. And this is definitely the case with movies that don't have a hugely invigorating hook or simply look just okay. I mean, why roll the dice on a bad night out at the movies when you can watch it considerably cheaper in the comfort of your own home mere weeks later? And Universal has been leading the charge in this regard with their aggressive premium VOD strategy, where most of their movies, which gross less than $50 million domestically in their opening weekend, are sent to PVOD in just 18 days, while even those which go north of $50 million will typically get there in just a month. And so, knowing that Universal will likely be sending The Fall Guy to streaming barely 2 weeks after it lands in cinemas, why deal with the hassle of splashing out on tickets, driving to the cinema, buying food and drink there, and perhaps having to hire a babysitter for the night when you can just do none of that and watch it at home 18 days later? Like Warner Brothers and Disney did in the midst of the pandemic, it essentially kneecaps a movie's box office prospects before it's even premiered. The bad release date. Look, it doesn't really matter how good a movie is if the release date is bad. And that's yet another area where The Fall Guy has suffered. While its original March 1st date would have seen it ill-advisedly go head-to-head with Dune Part 2, moving all the way to May didn't position it much better, considering the number of more highly anticipated blockbusters releasing throughout the rest of the month. From Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes to Furiosa, this consistent competition ensures there's really no path for The Fall Guy to enjoy a leggy steady box office run and keep bringing in the money weekend after weekend. Universal would have surely been better off releasing it in mid-March, where it could have been a few weeks removed from Dune Part 2, and its only major direct competition would have been Ghostbusters Frozen Empire, which ended up underperforming itself. Instead of that though, its ultimate release date has basically guaranteed that its box office legs will collapse in as little as a week, and it's got virtually no chance of staging an Elemental-esque comeback. And finally, audiences are tightening their belts. And finally, there's the unescapable fact that many people globally are struggling to deal with brutal inflation rates while not receiving wage increases to reflect this, as well as soaring utility bills. Life is pretty hard for a lot of people right now. And so, if you're only able to treat yourself to see maybe 3 or 4 movies at the cinema a year, are you really going to pick a merely decent-ish looking action comedy when you got busier deep dish prospects like Dune Part 2, Deadpool and Wolverine and Furiosa to look forward to? And The Fall Guy is certainly no outlier in this regard. 2024 has been a hugely underwhelming year at the box office so far for smaller and bigger films alike, with even the ultra-reliable horror genre underperforming relative to expectations. It's a wider sign that the vast swaths of the general public don't have masses of disposable income right now, and certainly not to spend on something as fleeting and arguably overpriced as a cinema ticket, especially when you can save some dough and catch it at home in the very near future. With that all in mind, it'll certainly be interesting to see how some of the year's most anticipated upcoming blockbusters actually perform. But from where we're sitting currently, it doesn't seem like 2024 is going to be a banner year for the industry, at least as far as box office bucks are concerned.